All right, question number 1 on your handout is the question, why do you think bad things sometimes happen to good people? You know, we study the book of Judges, and I think sometimes when we read about these people, we get the impression that every single individual in Israel was wicked. But that was not the case. There were some good people. There were still some faithful servants of God during the days of the Judges. Obviously, they suffered during those days. And so I want us to think a little bit about that question. And there's more than one answer, more than one correct answer to that. But why is it that bad things sometimes happen to good people? Yeah, I don't remember exactly when we talked about Paul being in paradise in 2 Corinthians 12, but I mentioned in that sermon a couple of reasons, you know, why it is that bad things sometimes happen to us, or we suffer and have afflictions like Paul did, his thorn in the flesh there. And one of it just has to do with the idea we're human. I mean, we're physical beings that live in a physical world. Because of that, there are certain tragedies that can befall us. We're subject to sickness, we're subject to disease, and it doesn't matter how good of life a person may live. Those are things that can affect us all. And it's just simply because of the type of creation that we are. Our bodies are mortal, and our bodies are subject to, again, the frailties of this world. And so sometimes it's just because we're human that bad things happen to good people. Anybody happen to that? I think all of us do, right? All right, why else? What are some other reasons?
I think because whether good people or bad people, everybody has free will, and bad people have free will to do bad things to good people.
Yeah. Okay, so sometimes because of the choices of others, right? And really the book of Judges, that's what, when you think about the good people that had to suffer, be carried into captivity, be robbed, just like the rest of the nation was robbed. Why did they have to go through those things? And the answer is because of the choice of other bad people. And so sometimes when bad people make bad choices, it doesn't matter how good of a life you might be living, there's consequences that come along with those choices, and they can affect all of us. Any other thoughts that come to mind?
Strengthen your faith.
Okay. The Bible teaches us that suffering and trials is a divine tool, doesn't it? A tool that God uses to help build godly character within us. And so think about if we went through life, and God gave us all these commandments, and we're following God and nothing ever bad happened to us, right? There was never any test of your faith. How would you know you'd really trust God no matter what? There's no way that you can know that unless your faith has been tested, right? Unless you've been put through trials. And they help us also to be patient people. They help us also to learn to develop perseverance, the Bible teaches us. And so it is the case that, when Christ came to this earth, was he a good person? Yeah, he was the best, right? Can't get any better than the life that he lived. Did bad things happen to him? Absolutely they did. But when those things come into our lives, they help develop our character to be more and more like Jesus. Jesus was a good person. He suffered bad things here upon this earth, and so it helps us to understand a little bit his walk of life. One other one that I have in here is sometimes we're the ones who are foolish and disobedient. You read about good people in the Bible, and by good people I don't mean sinless, because none of us are at that level. But you read about good people in the Bible who bad things happened to them because they foolishly disobeyed God. I mean, David is one of those characters that comes to my mind. How about Moses? He get to enter into the promised land? Why not? Because he foolishly disobeyed God. Was he a good person? Yeah, he was a good person. He's a great leader of the children of Israel. But sometimes we just make those foolish choices to disobey God, and because of that, bad things happen to us. So I want you to think about that idea, again, as we go through the book of Judges. It's not that everybody that we read about here is a terrible individual. There are some good people who are suffering some bad things during this difficult time. All right, so we're going to talk about Judges chapter 2, the need for judges tonight. And if I can, get somebody to read for us and read the first 6 verses for us there in Judges chapter 2. Then we'll look at some of these questions. Okay, so we read about, in verse 1 here, we read about the angel of the Lord. I don't know if you've done much study on that, or if you even looked into it this week or last week a little bit in our studies. But he plays an important role throughout the book of Judges. And really, he's played an important role from the time, I guess you could say, that God appeared, well, even before then, starting with Abraham. It's just kind of interesting. Just take some time sometime and go through the Old Testament and look at how many times this angel of the Lord is mentioned. I think there's nearly 60 times that he's mentioned throughout the Old Testament. So, a couple of things to note about this before we maybe talk just a little bit. We'll see how much time we got. What did he do? Okay, so his job, that word that's translated into our language as angel, it's the same word that's translated at times messenger. That's really all it means. Now, sometimes it is a spiritual being that comes from heaven with a message, but the reality of the word is it simply means a messenger. So this was the messenger of the Lord, and he came with a message, and it wasn't a positive message. There are other times when you read about him, it has a very positive message. Reassurance that's delivered to Israel and to leaders from time to time. But this particular instance, it wasn't that case. And if you read the first part of verse 1 there, it says, I think the King James Version says that he went up from Gilgal to Bochum. And that phrase, or that verb, went up, it's the same verb that's used back in chapter 1 a couple of times. Look back in chapter 1 in verse 4. It says, Then Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they killed 10,000 men at Bezek. If you look in verse 22 of Judges 1, it says, And the house of Joseph also went up against Bethel. So it's the idea, literally, of not just going somewhere, but it's more like the idea of attacking. Judah attacked the Canaanites and the Perizzites. They went up against them. The house of Joseph went up against Bethel. They attacked them. And so this is a idea that this angel is coming with punishment. It's a message. It's in the form of a message, but he's going up against Israel here and condemning them for some things that they haven't done properly. Another interesting idea here in verse 1 is, where does he come from? Gilgal. Do you know anything about Gilgal? Do you know a little bit of history behind Gilgal? Why would it be significant that this angel of the Lord is coming from Gilgal? Well, basically, when we study the Old Testament, there were about 3 different locations for the tabernacle of God. And remember, before Israel comes in and actually conquers the land of Canaan, Gilgal was kind of the headquarters of Israel. And we learn up till about chapter 18, till Shiloh becomes the place where the tabernacle goes. It's just kind of by implication, you learn the tabernacle is stationed here at Gilgal. And of course that represented God, it represented the presence of the Lord. And so this messenger of the Lord is coming from Gilgal, and he's coming to this place where Israel is, and he has a message for them. It's the message of punishment. Now, does anybody have an opinion as to who this messenger of the Lord is? It is interesting, like Wes pointed out in verse 1, the wording that he uses. He says, I led you up from Egypt and brought you to the land which I swore to your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you. Go ahead. There's the majority of commentators believe that it's probably one of those instances in the Old Testament where Christ appears to man. And again, it's interesting. Study that, the angel of the Lord, and study the wording that is used many times in these conversation, because when you read the pronouns, looks like it's the Lord himself, doesn't it, that's speaking to him. And so it's kind of an interesting idea, but again, a number of times that appears throughout the Old Testament, and those pronouns are used like that. So just a side study, but this is he plays an integral part in the book of Judges, but like I said, really if you go back to the Old Testament, you'll see him time and time again. So question number 3 here, what condition did the Lord put on his covenant with the nation of Israel? Right, God told them in verse 1 that he would never break his covenant with them. What was that unconditional? Maybe we should just ask the question, what was God's part of the covenant with Israel? What was his responsibility?
He was not to break his covenant, but his promise.
Okay, and a covenant is basically a two-sided agreement, right? And so what did God agree to do for Israel?
Give them the ability to wipe out the people who then came and make it theirs.
Yeah, he told them he was going to go with them. He was going to fight their battles. He was going to help drive the enemy out of that. And what was that? Was it unconditional? Was God just going to do that no matter what Israel did?
He told them to make no covenant with the inhabitants and tear down their altars.
Yeah, it was the covenant that God made with them was based upon their obedience, right? God says, if you do this, if you obey my laws and you keep your part of the covenant, I'll never forsake my part of the covenant. And his part of the covenant was if you listen to me and you obey me, I'm going to bless you. You're going to drive out your enemies. You're going to have a long life in this land. You're not going to have to worry about attacks from outsiders. You're going to live forever in this land if you guys will keep your part of the covenant. But it was based upon obedience. And the children of Israel, part of that covenant, like Robbie pointed out, part of that covenant entailed destroying all these other idols and gods whenever they went into this land. Well, did they do that? No. They didn't do what God told them to do. He said you need to drive out all the inhabitants, get all these wicked people out of your land. Did they do that? No, they didn't do that either, right? And so they were guilty of breaking their covenant with God. That's what the message is. The message of the angel of the Lord is, you've broken your covenant with God. And because you've broken your covenant with God, God's not going to keep his part. And that's what God told them in the beginning, right? If you do what I tell you to do, I'll bless you. But if you don't do what I tell you to do, what was going to happen? Yeah, he was going to punish them, and he was going to punish them with the people of the land. And so basically, God's part of the covenant was, I'll bless you if you obey me. If you don't obey me, then you're going to be punished and persecuted by the people of this land. And so this messenger of the Lord is coming to them and informing them God's going to keep his part of the covenant. You guys didn't keep your part in obeying, but now God said if you don't obey, here's what's going to happen to you. And that's really what the book of Judges, well, I guess in part, what the book of Judges is about. So question number 4 here, in what way did Israel suffer because of breaking their covenant with God? What happened to them because of it?
The enemy would be a snare, and he would drive them away for them.
Yeah, so he says in verse 3 there, right? I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their God shall be a snare unto you. So in other words, we read back in chapter 1, remember last week, these guys, they start fighting some of the enemy, and they can't drive them out, right? They can't overcome them. Well, why not? Yeah, that's what God said. He said, I'm not going to drive them out for you anymore. I think sometimes when we read chapter 2, or at least when I do, I get that impression, because at the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua dies. And so now we're reading the first of Judges, and we think, well, this is an event in the life of history where Joshua is already dead. But he's not. Notice in verse 6. It says, when Joshua had dismissed the people, the children of Israel went out to his own inheritance to possess the land. So this happened still during the days while Joshua was ruler. And when the people finally go home, God tells them, and, after they fought this major battles and broken up the strongholds, God says, I'm not going to drive all the rest of these enemies out for you because you haven't done what I told you to do. You haven't kept your part of the covenant. And so they were going to be thorns in their side. Now, there's an interesting psalm that kind of parallels some of the things, actually a history of the children of Israel. But if you have time, or you're trying to tie some of these things together, go back to Psalms chapter 106. Just write that down next to Judges chapter 2. And it'll give you a little bit of history and reference. And I'm just going to read a couple of things from it, but it kind of illustrates some of the things that's going on here. I'm going to read verse 15. This is Psalms 106. But in verse 15 it says, He gave them their request. Okay, so this is actually talking about a different scenario. But you think about the history of the children of Israel. You know, God tells them, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And they say, we want to do this anyway. What'd God do? He let them do what they wanted to do, right? He gave them their request. They didn't want to drive the enemies out of the land, right? They wanted to keep these idols. They wanted to live side by side with these people. They wanted to make covenants with them. God says, okay, I'll give you what you want, but you're not going to like it. Because these relationships are going to be a thorn in your side all the days that you live in this land. If you go on to verse 34 there, this is Psalm 106 again. They did not destroy the peoples concerning whom the Lord had commanded them, but they mingled with the Gentiles and they learned their works. You know, what happened to Israel because of these people? Well, if you think about the people themselves, there are times in the history of Israel where these people that they left afflicted Israel. They actually, got into battles with them. They actually waged wars. They lost lives. They caused them a lot of pain, physically speaking. And so sometimes they even ensnared them. Sometimes they even enslaved the children of Israel. And so God said, these people are going to, as long as you live in this land, you want to live with them, you're going to live with them. You're going to have exactly what you wanted. So the thorn was the idea. Also in question number 5 here, the gods of the Canaanites became a problem for the Israelites, right? They're described as a snare. I'm going to read again. This is Psalm 106, and I'm going to start in verse 36 here and read a couple verses. But it says this: They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. And the land was polluted with blood. Thus they were defiled by their own works. Therefore the wrath of the Lord was kindled against his people, so that he abhorred his own inheritance. And he gave them into the hand of the Gentiles, and those who hated them ruled over them. Their enemies also oppressed them, and they were brought into subjection in under their hands. Many times he delivered them, but they rebelled in their counsel, and they were brought low for their iniquity. So, you think about what happened because of these idols. Some of the things that Israel did involved the sacrificing of their own sons and daughters. And why did they do it? Because they were serving these idols, right? These were the idols that they were supposed to break down. These were the places that they were supposed to burn and get rid of. These were the people that they were supposed to drive out. But because they didn't, and because they intermingled with them, they adopted their religion. And so they began serving these other idols and sacrificing their own sons and daughters. And, I think about, a lot of times when I think about God's dealings with the children of Israel, I think about it kind of in a parent-child relationship. And I don't know if you probably everybody has. I don't think I'm alone on this. But have you ever had a child and you tell them, don't do this or don't do this and don't do this? And they keep saying, I want to do that. I want to do that. And finally you say, all right, you know what? If you want to do it, you go right ahead. Very well knowing that probably something's going to go wrong and there's going to be some bad things that go, not they're going to die or anything like that, but there's going to be some lessons that they learn because of that. Anybody do that in parenting? That's kind of what God did with Israel. He kept telling them, and he kept telling them, and he kept telling them. They said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to keep these people here. We want to serve these idols. We want to have these relationships with the people. And God says, okay, if that's what you want, then that's what I'm going to give you. But you're not going to like it. I've warned you time and time again, you're not going to like the consequences that come along with it. I think about the story of the prodigal son. Remember, the prodigal son comes to his father and he says, give me all my inheritance. And I think, well, why would a father do that to his son? Well, Do you think the prodigal son would have learned the same lessons if he hadn't gone through that experience? No, he probably still would have been that person, give me my inheritance, give me my inheritance, give me my inheritance, until he learned the lessons that came along with that and the responsibilities. And so that's what God did. And there are times when we read about in the Bible, that's what God does with humanity. If this is what humanity God wants, God's not going to fight with us constantly. This is what you want, this is what I'm going to give you. You're not going to like it. But if this is your desire, then I'm going to give you what your heart desires. That's basically what he did for the children of Israel here. So question number 6, how do the Israelites react to the Lord's separation because of them? There's actually a positive reaction in the beginning, right? What they do. Yeah, they wept, and verse 5, they offered sacrifices. But here's what we learned from studying the book of Judges. It was only a temporary, superficial response. When they initially heard all these things, they were torn up about it. They were offering sacrifices, but it wasn't long, and they were like, we're okay with this, That was just the nature of the children of Israel. It wasn't a life-changing event. No, it wasn't something where they amended their ways and they said, okay, we're going to serve God, and they stuck with doing what God told them to do. So it was a not true repentance. True repentance is life-changing, isn't it? I mean, it's not just being sorry. It's not just offering a sacrifice to God, but it's actually changing your life and changing your ways. And the children of Israel, of course, didn't do that in a long run. Short response. So we read later on here in the chapter about the death of Joshua. Like I said, we read at the end of the book of Joshua too, but this is kind of a repeat. Beginning in verse 7, we read about the faithfulness of Israel too. And so question number 7 is, if you look at verse 7 there in chapter 2, when were the Israelites faithful to their covenant with God? Yeah, while Joshua was alive, and did it stop after Joshua died?
No, not until the rest of the generation remembered the works of the Lord.
Yeah, even after Joshua died, there were still some elders in Israel who had served with Joshua, and as long as they were alive, Israel was faithful to the Lord. They were following their covenant with God. But again, what do we read about? Well, the next question here, how does God or the Bible describe the next generation? Verse 10. Yeah, they didn't know God and they didn't know the works that Israel had done, or that God had done for Israel. Now, that statement doesn't mean they didn't have any knowledge of God. It doesn't mean they didn't have any knowledge of the works that God had done for Israel when he brought them into that land. The idea is that it wasn't something that they were acquainted with or something that they held close. When you know somebody, you're talking about you have a relationship with them. It's not just that, I heard their name one time. You don't know somebody, you heard their name one time. But it implies there's some knowledge and some relationship that goes along with that. They didn't have that close relationship with God. Now, Joshua and his generation, we read about how they kept the works of God alive. They kept talking about these things. They kept leaning on them. They had a relationship with God. And so the question that I want to ask is, why do you think this generation didn't know God and didn't know the great works that God had done for them? Now, I know sometimes when we talk about this, I think we point fingers at the previous generation. But think about Joshua and his generation. Were they faithful servants of God? They were, weren't they? Did they keep the works of God alive? That's what it says. So why would this generation not know God or know the works that he'd done for Israel?
The other groups and the gods that ensnared them.
Yeah, the reason is because they didn't have any desire to know God, right? They didn't have any desire to keep these great works of God alive. And the Bible teaches us there's two responsibilities, right? And we all know this as parents too. But just take it as an illustration in the world today. You can take a person in this world today and you can teach them everything they need to know about God. And you can tell them about the mighty works of God. Does that guarantee they're going to be a follower of God? Why not? It's because of their heart, right? If they don't have the desire, it's not going to happen. And so when I think about Joshua and his generation, did they do what was right? Did they teach the next generation? I think they did. I think the problem was they were just raising a generation that was so worldly minded, and they had all these people and the things that they were doing had so much appeal to them. They didn't want anything to do with God. And they didn't want anything to do with this covenant that God had made with them. And so you think about the responsibility. Every generation has a responsibility. We have a responsibility to teach and instill values within the next generation. But that next generation has a responsibility too to make those values their own and those teachings their own. And so it goes back to this idea, can a parent teach a child and take them to church all the time and instill all the right values in them and they still go wrong? Absolutely. And the answer is, somebody said, well, why does that happen? Well, the answer isn't always because it was the fault of the generation before. Sometimes it's just that generation has no desire. Until they have that desire, nothing's going to change. Yes, sir.
I wonder if the new generation, not knowing the Lord, has to do with complacency. They grew up in a time where things were going right, and they're like, well, sort of paraphrase an idea. They're like, well, they didn't do what we were told, and it wasn't that bad. Now everything's great. So where's the consequence? It's not that bad.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And they grew up, like you said, they grew up in a completely different atmosphere and environment than the generation before.
They didn't have nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah, they had so many blessings too. And, as is often the case, the Bible teaches us more that we have, the less we feel that we need God. That's just human nature. And so maybe because they had everything provided for them, they didn't think, well, we have a need for God like the generation before. But anyway, it's an interesting thought. But that next generation, did not know God, did not know the wonderful works that He'd done for Israel. So ultimately, Israel is influenced. Question number 9 here. We're going to have to kick it in high gear, so I'm going to blaze through these questions. Israel was influenced by the people around them, the nations that they led. That was, I don't want to say maybe it's a good thing. I'm going to say maybe it was the root of their problem. If they had done what God told them to do, I know this, they certainly would have been better off, wouldn't they? If they'd done what God told them to do. But sometimes, we think, well, we can surround ourselves with all these different people, and they're not going to affect us, right? How did it work for Israel?
It's like you said last week, utterly destroy them all. How hard would that really be?
Yeah, it would be, humanly speaking, it would be a terrible task. I can't imagine it. But at the same token, too, God doesn't lay on us more than we can bear. So that's something to think about. And those guys were the soldiers who were doing it. But like you said, it would have been difficult from a humane standpoint. So what happens to Israel because of their unfaithfulness to the Lord? Well, He allows robbers to come, take everything that they have. He allows them to be sold into their hands of the enemy. But from time to time, God shows Israel mercy by raising up judges. Why does God show them mercy? Why does He raise up these judges? He loves them, right? Even though they're disobedient, right? He still wants what's best for them. So from time to time, He's reminding them about His goodness, about His mercy, about their covenant with Him, even though they didn't deserve it. God's providing them relief. He's rescuing them from their enemies, saving them from their hands, liberating them. Israel responds, though. If you read the rest of this chapter, it seems like it implies, during the days of those judges. Now, does that mean that all Israel turned to God? No. you know that from reading the book of Judges. But sometimes they wouldn't listen. They chased after these other gods. The Bible says they quickly turned aside from the right way. They committed short term. They would be delivered and they'd be so thankful and they'd turn to God and then they'd be like, I don't really like this. I liked it the way it was before. I like to be able to do my own thing and live my own life. And so they'd go right back into the hands of their enemies. And not only that, question 13 here, but they become even more corrupt. Every time they go back, they took evil and disobedience to a new level. And so the Bible teaches us they progressively became worse and worse and worse until they became just like the people that God had driven out of this land. So how did the Lord react to Israel's disobedience? Well, how does God react to a hard heart, a stubborn heart that continues to commit sin despite knowing what is right? He was furious with them, the Bible says. And so he pours out his judgment upon them. He said, I'm not going to drive out any more of these nations. And ultimately, he uses these enemies. How does he use them? Question number 5 here. How does God use these enemies of Israel? Look at verse 22. Yeah, to test his people. All right, who were his true followers? Who were going to be committed to him no matter what? And so ultimately, God used that to determine who was his followers and who were not. So, all right, so that's Judges chapter